Good morning. Welcome. Thank you very much for coming. 10 minutes ago, I thought it was just going to be me and Veronique. So I'm very grateful for the sudden rush of people at the end. I should also explain that I'm not fearing kind of crowd violence. That the fence is there because, of course, we're going to have a play soon which has an orchestra. So we've removed some of the chairs, and the orchestra will be there, and the fence is to stop people falling off into the orchestra. Or we could use it as an elephant pit, I guess, but there we go. Anyway, so welcome. I'm going to try and go through these things today. So this is a repeat of the forum that I did last week. So if you were here last week, you're going to hear almost exactly the same thing as before. Following on from some of the questions and comments from last time, I've made a few changes as well, so there might be a slight change. These are the things that I'm going to cover. So I'm going to talk a bit about some of the projects we're taking forward as part of the strategic plan. A very short thing about safety and access to warn you about something that's going to change in January. Two people sent in questions, one about the study of Mandarin and one about the planning for after-school activities, and then there is a chance for general questions. Because the crowd is a small but select group, I would suggest that if you've got questions as we go through, then please feel free to ask, and I will stop and do my best to answer them. Okay? So the more questions you ask, the more interesting it will be, much like my physics lessons. So, okay, I want to talk about these strategic projects first of all, and this is really to pass on some of the information that was discussed at the most recent board retreat. So last year we spent a lot of time asking people what they thought about ISL, what was good about ISL, and also what people wanted from an education. And so what we've been trying to do is trying to reduce that down to a small number of points that are clear. And we think that we can reduce all the information down to 4 key points or 4 key focuses. And the idea is, what kind of education do we want for our children, and therefore what does the school need to be like if we want that kind of future for them. So the first point, which was really interesting, was about the kind of education that people were looking for. And people were very much looking for a very forward-looking education. There are, of course, as many educations as there are schools. And there are some schools that very much trade on the idea of tradition. But what was very clear from both the staff and the students and the parents, that the kind of education our community was looking for was very much one that would prepare children for a much more uncertain future. And so this idea of a very forward-looking, a very rigorous education came through loud and clear. And of course that's about preparing children to address problems and answer questions themselves. The second idea that came through very clearly was this idea about preparing people to be in a world where stresses and strains are inevitable. So it's absolutely possible to teach young children or young people ways to cope with the stresses and strains of the modern day. Email is not going to disappear, and so people need to be able to have the tools to deal with that, to deal with pressure. And the focus was very much on long-term health and well-being. And that's not just for the students, however, for all members of the community. So that will be very much our second focus. The third focus was about internationalism. We're an international school, and the internationalism of our school was something that people were looking for. We're looking for an environment that values diversity, that makes the most of diversity. It's not enough to say diversity is a good thing, but you've got to do something with it. You've got to use that kind of cultural capital that we have access to. And we want young people to learn how to work with people who may come from a very different background from themselves. Part of that is linguistic, part of that is cultural, part of that is just living with people rather than just living alongside people. They're quite different things. So that was the third aspect. We're incredibly lucky because of where the school is. If that's our aim, we're in a very multinational, multicultural, multilingual country. We have amazing resources on our doorstep, so we need to make the very most of those resources. And the third one is actually about the capacity to have an impact. And what's really interesting is that lots of research shows that children learn to feel that they can make a difference when they feel connected, when they are rooted, and when they are part of a community. And so we have our fourth idea, which is about fostering an engaged, supportive community. If we want children to take responsibility and make decisions, we need to provide them with the environment in which that is possible and which it is supported. So those are our four major directions. They are not expressed in pretty marketing language or advertisement speak, but those are kind of the ways that, good morning, that we are pushing. And really, I could stop there, which would be a very short directors forum, but I wanted just to give you a little bit of detail about each of those areas to show you the kinds of things that we're doing. But just before I move on, does anyone want to ask a question or make a statement? I shall take that as warm, enthusiastic agreement. Okay. So how do we go forward? There's actually a lot of work to do. This is the kind of the landing page of a website that we use with staff. And what we've asked all members of staff to do is become involved in at least one of those projects. And there are two reasons for this. One is the school is more likely to make progress if we do it as a collective effort. And two, really, to be frank, there's so much going on that I can't do everything. It's just not possible. So we need to spread the work. It's also an opportunity for us to disseminate and devolve leadership. We want people to have the opportunity to lead projects that they are passionate about. And so we're trying to spread these things around. So the kinds of projects that we're taking forward, these are the ones that are linked to the nature of the education. So, for example, we spent some time last year looking at research that explains what we know is effective in the classroom. And educational research continues. We want the school to be very rooted in educational research. We don't want to just base our stuff on what we think works. We want to make sure we know what works. And we're changing a lot of the way that we do, for example, appraisal based on that research. So having a really clear understanding of what supports good learning is completely vital. It makes pedagogy, teaching, an artifact to examine, and we need to do that over time. So research will be very much our base. We need to have a curriculum that is published to everybody so everybody knows what to expect at an appropriate level of detail. One of the pieces of feedback we got last year from the parent survey was that people didn't always think that the information was easily accessible. So we're going to make it more accessible. I talked about what supports good learning. One of the things that supports good learning very strongly is if, as professionals, we watch each other work. I said that at the last forum, one of the most interesting things about moving from journalism, which is what I used to do, into teaching is that journalism, day by day, I knew exactly how I was doing because everybody saw my work. And if I was doing well, my work was published. And if I was doing badly, my work was spiked and it just got thrown in the bin. So it was pretty obvious what worked and what didn't. Teaching is an interesting profession in that largely you are alone with children. And so we want to make observation a really central part of our professional development. And to do that, we need to teach people how to observe. It's much more difficult than you think. I go into lessons, and because I'm pretty swotty, I enjoy the lesson. I tend not to look at the teacher and what they're doing. So we need to teach people how to observe and also how to be observed. Data is key. Schools are rich in data. They don't use it very well in general. We don't do longitudinal analysis of data. And so that's an area that we really need to work on. And the final one is about the effective and balanced use of technology. The word balance there is really important. More stuff is not necessarily better than less stuff. So technology can be transformational. It can also be harmful. And so we need to be clear about when we use it. When we use it and when we don't. So in my own classroom, I teach science, and there are definitely times when I want children to have laptops open, I want them to engage in that way. There are other times when a pencil is absolutely the right tool to use. As you know, we have, particularly in the high school, quite tight rules about when children can access recreational technology and when they can't. And when I was preparing for this last time, Simon Foley sent me this, which is a sign that's kind of going up in areas. We have tech-free areas in the school. The cafeteria is a tech-free area. I love the idea of interact with reality. So there you go. So it's really important. And of course, in the same way as a parent, I'm trying to negotiate and navigate my child's interaction with technology. I have 2 children. In the same way, the school is trying to navigate and negotiate that place because it's new for everybody. Yeah, we've never been in this position before. I think that's fantastic. So I'll just briefly pause after each bit. Is that okay? Are there questions? Simon, yes.
So how are the staff responding to this idea of observation? Because that's quite a big shift for them.
Yeah. So thank you for that almost planted question. The sign up for the observation protocol is the project that received the most volunteers. Interestingly, and the reason is, most people theoretically subscribe to the idea that observation is a really good thing, and yet there is an illogical fear of being observed. And it's really interesting when I go into classrooms that people's reaction can be either they just kind of carry on and do their own thing, or they can suddenly freeze because the director's turned up and everyone kind of goes like that. Of course, the more we talk about it, the more it becomes normalised, and we've actually got to have an environment where people can kind of come and go. So it's been very positive, actually. I think we all recognise that it's a significant shift in the right direction if we can make it normal. Oh, yes.
Just another on the same idea as a professional myself. I've always found from my training on to my practice that when I was observing colleagues, most of my light bulb moments come from observation. You really pick fantastic ideas and thought yourself, it's a fantastic way of sharing very good practice that otherwise a lot of teachers would not have access to because there's always so much time you have to do your research yourself, so it's a fantastic way of sharing the practice.
Absolutely. So I've always considered myself really lucky because I get to observe a lot of people, and I am absolutely sure that every single good piece of teaching I do now I've stolen from somebody else. Absolutely. I'm really happy to steal other people's good ideas and pretend that they're mine. Okay, so here's the second one. Now you've heard a bit about this. We're making a real effort to rewrite the kind of well-being programme for the school. So traditionally, when the school was smaller, as is normal in small schools, this idea of the care and concern for young people often happens organically because everybody knows each other. As the school has become bigger, it needs to be much more systematised to make sense, to make sure that every child is known, every child knows where to go if they've got a problem, and that we're giving people the right information in good time. There's no point in us telling children about the evils of drugs every year and nothing else. Actually, we've got to time our interventions carefully. So we have a group working on that. We have a group working on this research partnership with the SHUV, which is fascinating. That one is much more a longer term investment. I think it's going to be 5 years before we have enough data there to make significant changes. It's a good scientific study that we're doing alongside the paediatric services of SHUV of interventions. And of course, we need to have an intervention and look at the effect of that intervention over time. So that's a really fascinating one. The third one is also important, and here's a real shift. So when I started teaching, if a child came to me and they were upset about something, what I did is I sent them somewhere else. I sent them to the nurse, or I sent them to the counsellor, or I sent them to the deputy head, or I just sent them away. And now the focus is changing to say, actually everybody has a responsibility to deal with young children if they've got a problem. If that's a physical problem, it's first aid. So for example, in November, all members of staff will be first aid trained, so we can all do CPR. But also, all members of staff have got to be able to respond if someone comes to them with a problem with their own mental well-being. And so, again, we will still have counsellors, we still have a nurse, but we're also trying to provide training for every member of staff that they can intervene, because it is more and more a problem around the world. So that's the second block. Any questions about that? Okay, lovely. The third one, I do think this idea of individual responsibility coming out of a sense of belonging is a really interesting idea. That it's only when children feel that they belong somewhere that they then feel compelled, if you like, to make decisions and to try and bring about change. And so the idea is that we all can have an effect on the education of our children, and that the education of our children will be richer for it. So there's a lot of work on communication, and as I said at the start, one of the criticisms of the school was that the communication was bitty. In some areas pretty good, in some areas actually pretty poor. So we've spent a lot of time on communication. If you have shares in a post-it note company, then we are contributing to your profit this year, because the number of post-its we've used is astronomical. These are all pictures of a particular kind of marketing workshop that we've been doing with a new head of marketing. We've also spent a lot of time trying to understand how we talk about the school, how do we clarify the messages that we want to get across so that they are clear to everybody. We did some work at the board retreat on this idea of our kind of value proposition. What do we promise, and how do we make sure that if we promise it, that's what we can achieve? We've also spent time trying to understand what happens from the parental point of view. Like many organisations, in the past we've often thought about what's easy for us. How do we make it work for our systems, rather than how do we make it work for someone else? And so this is some of the data from the application journey of a person who lives overseas. So we're trying to understand those. How do we make that as easy as possible and as complete as possible? And here's our idea. That, so at the moment we're trying to think about our identity and how we talk about ourselves, and we get to a new website at the end of the year. Most people think that the website is fine but a bit clunky. In the parent survey, the word clunky was used 7 times, I counted. And so clearly we need to do something there. It's not a disaster, and so it's not something we need to change immediately. It's also something we want to plan for. So that's connected to the idea of communication. I do think that schools should be examples of how society can function effectively. Otherwise, how do children learn that societies can behave in a way that's rational? Because not all societies that we see at the moment behave pretty rationally. When we did the staff climate survey, people thought that the staff, with relation to the children, treated everybody fairly. Staff didn't feel that we treated each other fairly, interestingly enough, regardless of race or gender. And so we have a group at the moment, and we're also working with PricewaterhouseCoopers to understand actually how we can ensure that we treat everybody fairly, whether that's in terms of our recruitment policies, for example, or how we deal with things internally if something is raised. So it's a really interesting project. We don't have, just for the sake of argument, we don't have any policy on transgender children. We don't, as far as we're aware, we don't have any transgender children at the moment, but that will come, and so we need to be prepared for that when it does come. It's really important. And then the last bit is really trying to actively involve people in the community and in our ideas. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a while. So again, I'll just pause there momentarily. Any questions or thoughts? Simon.
Just an observation.
Yes.
In the UK, where I'm from, they've just appointed a minister for loneliness, which is fascinating. And I was listening even on the radio this morning, a reflection that how important it is as humans that we're not just being, but we're being with each other. And that's actually how we can be more rewarded in life and avoid some of the stresses and strains. And if that idea is coming through, this idea of encouraging the community, not just amongst the kids, but the staff and the whole, these parents, everybody who comes to touch ISL, that feels quite forward.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. No, I think so. The quotation from one of the other members of staff, which I think is very, very powerful, is individuals exist within communities, and that's absolutely true. And so we have to understand the individual's place, and there's a place for individualism, but we have to understand that individual's place in the wider community.
Yeah, in fact, the community celebrates the differences.
Absolutely.
It provides a home for all of that individuality.
Absolutely. So here is our last thing, which is really about interconnectedness and internationalism and how we make the most of that. An international education is not a national education overseas. Or there are versions of that, but ISL does not have a kind of a national flag at the front gate to say this is an American school or a UK school or a French school. Actually, it's not. It's none of those. And so we have to understand how to make the most of our internationalism. And as I say, making the most of that cultural capital that we have. There are two things which I think push the same direction. Okay? And they are, I think, really fundamental to the kind of education that we want. Service is something that we need to actually change our view of slightly. The point of service is to teach children that they can have an effect, not necessarily to save the world now. Service is pedagogic, it's educational. And getting children to understand that they can have a capacity to bring about change in a social sphere is what service is there for. In the same way, innovation is a way that we can teach children that they have the capacity to bring about change or to have an impact in a more kind of technological sphere. But they're both the same idea. It's just about children having the space to think and to find a solution. So the idea of those two as a pair, I think, is extremely strong. But they both push the same way. They're not different things. One is problems amongst people, if you like, and another one is more kind of innovative, maybe business or maybe technological sense of a problem. So those are going to be big focuses for us. And of course, through both of those, we can make extensive use of our community, of the place in which we live. So, as an example, innovation, we're on the doorstep of EPFL. Switzerland, incredibly, someone pointed out to me the other day, is rated #1 in the world by INSEAD for innovative thought. I didn't know that. So we have amazing resource there in terms of innovation. Who knew? We have a real chance to use service, again, as a mechanism to connect with our wider community there. Really fundamental to that is our children's language ability. And there are any number of reasons why we should do a better job there. Parents were critical of the school in terms of the language provision that we have. If children speak French better, then they have more chance to interact with community. Their education will be richer. We can make more of what's on our doorstep. Bilingualism in itself is a very positive thing for a child. Also, so is your home language. Again, we want to make the most of people's richness and people's culture. So we have a significant focus on that. In fact, this evening I lead a meeting of all the French teachers to start to think about how we can change the nature of the pedagogy in French, how we can change the position of French inside the school. The school thinks of itself as an Anglophone school, and so how do we make it more than that? We're also going to talk about what we can put around the school to make it more multilingual. So we want to value language a great deal more. I just want to quickly have a little focus on the innovation. So we've had a couple of sessions on innovation. We asked these kind of questions to people. You may remember that at the start of the year I sent out a letter which asked people that if you are interested in innovation, then please come and contribute. And there are all different versions of innovation. Okay, so there are in schools co-working spaces. This is not in a school, clearly, but a co-working space is a possible version of innovation. A maker space is a possible version of innovation. Extensive use of technology. There are a whole range of, I'm not quite sure we want to strap small children into headsets all day, but nevertheless. Those are all possible things. I think our challenge is to find the way to drive innovation in our community. And what was really interesting, because we've done 2 workshops now, one with, as you can see on your left, one with a group of parents, and on your right, one with the board, is the idea that actually innovation is for everybody. Yeah? We don't have an innovation centre just so that we can support the next Steve Jobs. Actually, innovation is something that can be taught, and we want to engender, to encourage innovative thought throughout the school. So we talked about what do we understand as innovation, and we talked about the kind of skills. And actually, they were just good thinking skills, the usual thinking skills that you would list: courage and creativity and persistence. So we've had those 2 workshops. Our next step in this area is to run a student workshop. I met with the team yesterday dealing with innovation. We'll run a student workshop because they also have ideas in this area. We come up with a preliminary design, and we hopefully design workshops, and we go on to identify mentors. Now, I said there that it's a good example, I think, of where we can involve the community. So we have a group of parents who are very innovative, who could possibly act as mentors, who can come in and help us think and come in and help the children think. Because what we need, of course, is the innovation space, whatever that looks like, to be real. We need children dealing with real problems and to give the children real responsibility. So that's kind of our progress so far on innovation. Again, I'll just pause there briefly before I move on. Any questions or thoughts? Yes, hello.
Just going back to something in your introductory speech at the end of the year, you're incredibly excited about the service projects.
Yeah.
And talking about innovation and communication, it's all part of that. But I think this is a small part of it if anyone's interested. But I think if the emphasis is going to be on service, community and action service, I've spoken to a couple of teachers in middle school I'm talking about primarily. It's a big thing for them how to motivate the children, and I know that it's Mr. Aldersey that's in charge of this role. Yeah. And being a bit forward, but perhaps suggesting again that maybe in the middle school to motivate and inspire the children to take the initiative and to be innovative in this area, somebody to perhaps be more in charge of that. It's a very small place to start, and I know they're supposed to be independent, thinking about what they want to do in the community to therefore, in the future, do better things and to see that they can actually achieve something to help others. Is that something that you have thought about, or is that filtered back to you at all? Somebody to be in charge or to be a mentor, and I suggested perhaps high school students could perhaps be mentors for middle school students, and that be part of their CAS project, because it's talked about a lot, and I know the parents really don't know what's going on. The students themselves, you've got some who are really, really excited about going up to the refuge and helping dogs or helping in the community. There are things going on, but I would say for 70% of the students in middle school particularly, there is a little bit of a loss. So they need that spark or motivation or direction. That can come from high school students or from member of staff that really, really takes
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. I think that service is really fundamental in a school. And the school I came from before I was here was probably the school that's most well known in the world for service as an approach. It was a bigger school, but like, for example, on Thursday, 2,000 children left the school to go and do service. And everybody did it weekly, and it was an expectation. And I remember sitting in a bus once. Children are funny, because if you're a teacher in a bus, they imagine you go deaf. So there I was sitting, and there were two children behind me, and they were talking about maths homework and service, because I had a maths test the next day. And one said to the other, I kind of thought about missing service, because I think like my maths test isn't going to be so great tomorrow, but actually there's no way you can miss service. And I thought, that's a good sign, actually, if people are valuing those kind of things over a maths test. And I think that the thing about service is, first of all, one is we've got to drive people to experience. And so we have to provide enough real experience for young children, young people, to understand what they can do and understand that actually there's much more in them than they think, that they can do extraordinary things if they're presented with the opportunity to. And that takes organisation, yes. and that takes people to organise it. So absolutely, yeah. I also think that the nature of the interaction is incredibly important. So the interaction can't be false. If children do things and it doesn't matter, just like you, if you're doing things which don't matter, you don't try very hard. Well, absolutely. And why bother? And why do it again? Okay. One of my strongest criticisms of school service in general, not just here, but in schools in general, is that I think most school service, or most service, ends as soon as school ends. And I don't think that children automatically feel that this is part of my life that I want to continue. And I think that through a kind of a structured program of service, you can introduce children to the idea that they can have an effect, and that effect is worth doing. Both it's worth doing for the person, but it's also worth doing for themselves in terms of kind of altruism as a driver of self-value, isn't it? And so I think you've got to provide those things so that later children can kind of take control. And I absolutely agree, structure is what it needs. Yeah.
Someone to mentor to read,
yeah.
That's great.
Yeah. I think there are two aspects as well, actually. Not everyone agrees with it here, but I think there is the mentoring aspect. I think there's also the impelling aspect. Because when I think that if you're going to, you might have a child who says, I don't really want to go and do any service at all, I'm a bit too busy. And I think that we have responsibility to say, no, really, sorry, you've got to go. In the same way as we think, I'll use the example of maths again. We think that maths is important, and whether you want to go to your maths lesson or not, you're still going. And I think the same has to be true of service, because it's only through experiencing it that you understand its effect, actually. So it's a major project for us, and I think there's a real shift in how we see it. Yes.
Is this something that possibly parenting is involved with?
Yeah, it is.
PTA,
yeah.
Collaboration that way, that if there's no staff available or testing students,
yeah.
Not in the past, I've been very much involved with it many years ago.
Yeah.
But I'm not sort of qualified, or the way the school is doing CAS at the moment. I know with the middle school leadership team, they admitted they really struggle. They have so much they're teaching and doing everything else. They don't really have the time to do anything, and you can't just get parents coming in, and it's got to be structured.
No, I appreciate that, but just throwing it in as a willingness, particularly, I understand from the council perspective, I think that maybe that's slightly different. It'd be nice to have students involved to direct it. But yeah, then that's something for next year. But just thinking in general, as you said, the innovation and the service element, because of the community we don't live in, the community we don't have people where we
Yeah, I think that's true. So I think parental involvement is really useful. It's really important. It really enriches the thing. What we have to be careful that we don't do, though, is so there are particular things that I am passionate about. I mustn't impose myself and my beliefs and my sense of importance, on children and say, okay, kids, we're all going to do X because I think it's the most important thing in the world. So I think that part of the service programme is about engendering leadership, giving children real responsibility, and I think that parents and staff together can support that. What it mustn't be is parents and staff saying, this thing is important to me, and so therefore I'm going to make it important to you, because then we neuter the children effectively. Okay, so thank you. Oh, sorry, was there another question?
I was just wanting to also comment on that, because we are, as primary school parents, I was just really listening very interestingly, because for us this topic seems quite far away, and I thought, wow, that's maybe also an opportunity to establish some intergenerational dialogue in school, because I think also the younger ones would actually benefit from looking at these examples. And then my other kind of thought just came up was, I think it's maybe also a question about being well informed, because a lot of people who come into school are maybe not completely familiar with the environment, with the opportunities that lie there for social engagement or other things. If you want to do something locally, I think you can also do something other contexts that's not local. But I think there's maybe also an interesting thought that you would establish more kind of rootedness in the environment.
You do, absolutely. Yes, I have a whole range. I went forward and a whole range of kind of stories about how children have formed important lifelong links as a result of particular experiences in service. And I do think service is one of those really interesting things, in that it's something we learn now, and then maybe absolutely we see the benefit of that in 20 or 30 years, but it's an investment worth making, because we have to think about the longer term. That's part of our responsibility. Okay, I will move on. I should say, actually, I've got to be out of here on time because there is a sound check for the play this evening, and I will be told off if I'm late. Okay, so I will just move along. Again, I've put this in here as a way of gathering a bit of feedback, actually, in general, people's thoughts. So, like many schools, we've been thinking very hard about safety, particularly the safety of the campus. We have an unusual campus in that there are two buildings separated by a public road. So the road that goes down the middle is not ours. It belongs to Lausanne. Well, half of it belongs to Lausanne and half of it belongs to Le Mans, which is even more confusing. However, we can't enclose the campus as many schools would do. And there are many parents who would like us to enclose the campus completely. There are also, on the other hand, many parents who want the school to be incredibly open. And so we have that difficulty of, we want to be an inclusive community, and we want people to come in, and we want people to feel welcome, and at the same time we've got to keep children safe. So there are a number of things that we're going to do. The starting point, now this doesn't solve all problems by any stretch of the imagination. The starting point is actually about controlling access to the buildings, and I could have chosen any number of statements from different countries, and I just happened to have chosen this one, which is from Ofsted, which is the UK Office for Standards in Education. And one of the things that when they inspect schools, they expect absolutely to see use of badges in schools as a way of controlling access. Now, a badge, as I say, only opens a conversation. If you look at when terrible things have happened in schools, they're nearly always done by members of the community, not by strangers. But having a badge system allows us to talk to people and understand where people should be and where they shouldn't be. So what we will do come January is be much firmer about badges. So when you come to the school as a visitor, you need to sign in and you'll need to get a badge. How many of you at the moment are wearing badges? Thank you, Mark. Well done. Oh, okay. 2 Okay, so clearly, I mean, that's interesting. You've done nothing wrong, because at the moment, the normal expectation is that people come and go in the buildings freely. Interestingly, when the buildings were built, when this building was built, the working hypothesis was that free access. We even put a kind of a coffee corner for parents in the building. So the thinking process is that we want adults to come in and out of the building. Actually, that's not safe, because we have no way of knowing who is here. So what we're going to do is ask people to sign in. If you're going to come into the South Campus, we don't have a reception in the South Campus, South Building, so you will unfortunately need to go to the North Building, sign in, and then come across. And so we will start to ask you to do that. If you're a frequent visitor, actually here's a longer term thing as well we'll do. In the short term, because there are a lot of people to deal with, in the short term we will say that parents and frequent visitors can just get their own badge and keep it. So we will get you in, take your photo, provide a badge for you, and that allows you to come and go more freely because you are known, you don't have to sign in every time. Over time, there's no reason why we wouldn't make that available to all parents as we go forward, which just means that visitors have to sign in. We're not going to do it on a one-off, because to have 1,000 parents turn up to say, I'd like my photo taken, please, on a Tuesday morning would be difficult. So we will do it progressively. Members of staff, we issued a badge, and the idea is that members of staff, the badges, another good idea from a parent last time, the badges will be colour-coded so we know who's a member of staff, who's a parent, who's a visitor, and if we see you in the wrong place, without a badge or with the wrong colour badge, we will say, can I just ask why you're here, please? Yeah. I regularly see people who I don't know wandering through the halls of the primary school regularly, and that shouldn't be the case. So this allows us, instead of me just marching up and saying, who are you? It allows me to open a conversation and to understand what's going on. And then we can go further, of course, but this is just a first step. Okay? Again, I shall pause. Any reactions or thoughts to that? Yes?
Yeah, at the recent PTA meeting, we were discussing how we can improve the community feel of the student now after having been exposed to the big school. And I think we discussed that one thing that we've seen in other schools around the world is that one thing that really makes a huge difference is if parents can come in after drop off and have a coffee and kind of mingle without having to be there for a particular reason, not having a meeting, not having anything else to do. So if that's not going to happen, because that doesn't sound that that would work with this setup, how we can build this community that everybody's talking about that we need for this school?
Yeah. So it's a really good question. How do you build community? So I think we have to kind of do both. Maybe the next slide helps it. I think what we can do is we can designate areas where people can be, and we can say you can be here freely. What we need to do, of course, is locate a coffee corner or a cafeteria area. In fact, we're going to put chairs and tables out in a particular area of the entrance to the North Campus to try and encourage people to come and have their cup of tea and sit. I'm actually really supportive of parents coming after drop-off, particularly do French lessons or whatever. You can come and do French lessons and have a chat afterwards. It's a really positive thing for school. So we need to provide spaces for those, but in an area that we can control, that we're aware of. And the only area that we can really control at the moment is the entrance to the North Campus. So we need to make the most of that space, and that's how we do it. Yeah.
But then it's really attached to go in there or not.
So what we will say is at particular times, in particular areas, that's okay, there's a kind of free area there, but what you can't do is you can't go from there off to somewhere else. If you want to go into the primary school, then absolutely you need to sign in to say I'm going to see whoever and get a badge. So it's a kind of a halfway house between locking everything down, which I don't think we want to do because we want people to come in and to contribute, but being more aware of kind of comings and goings in the school.
There's also one thing that I decided to start going now, and we've done that 3-4 times, so I don't think it's more than service. The other thing is from a safety perspective, when the school doesn't know when people are in, case of the fire or so, it's not going to be safety for, I would say, very close to about it. And the school doesn't want people are in. They don't know how many people that need to take out in case of the results.
Well, I'm completely
And
agree.
I think that,
I'm not saying it's bad thing to know how many people are in school at all. I'm just saying, how can we combine the two things to do the community as well?
but I think to the point, I think that the two things like matching and making people control of who's where doesn't necessarily bite the area where you can more control than responsibility.
But I didn't know about the doctors and everything, so now I know.
Yeah, no. I mean, ironically, we're trying to encourage parents in. So you would have seen, some of you, that we put those kind of display columns in North Campus. And we put those because we thought if we can put up children's work there, then parents, when they're waiting, can look at something nice. So we're actually trying to make that a better space to be in. There's also going to be, as you come in the door on the right-hand side, there's going to be a kind of primary school museum, which is curated by the students, which also you can go and look at. So we're trying to make it more inviting to come in and maybe more interesting to come in. But at the same time, we need to manage that. Yes, sorry.
I think it's a lovely initiative. I just, one part told the seminar, I was just a bit confused. If we get a frequent visitor card, we still need to sign in. We always need, we are issued a card, we always need to tell reception, I'm here.
See, that's an interesting point. We'll do that.
Because you cannot know that I'm here.
No, that's true.
To evacuate in case of a fire, if I don't tell someone I'm here. We like on companies where you punch the card.
Yeah, so we don't have kind of card access to doors, which would be fantastic. The investment necessary for that is considerable. That might be something we consider in the long term, which allows that. But it's a tricky problem, isn't it? I mean, we're trying to make it possible to come in and at the same time control people without being kind of fixed on. I think we're in the stage of trying to understand that. In fact, if anybody is a security expert, really happy for a chat. Julia, sorry, you wanted to.
No, I just wanted to say also that I think it's really good to think about this kind of accessibility on campus and to structure it in a way that you presented, but also not to see that as the only possibility to socialize and mix with the community. I mean, you already said at the beginning there are many other ways, and I have to say I feel it's very positive that the communication between teachers and parents, for example, that are also considered part of the community building, has been so structured since the beginning of this term. I really, from my personal perspective, I really looking forward every week to receive the weekly letter, the weekly email, with all the curriculum information, etc. And I think it's the same with the social, getting together on campus. It's also possible to link up, with ICT to access other portals, etc., or see each other. And in the end, there's also a personal responsibility to engage yourself as well. So,
yeah.
I mean, it's one part to do this on campus, but
Yeah,
many other ways as well.
Absolutely. No, that's absolutely true. Yes.
We had another situation yesterday evening. My son and me left the school building a little bit later. I guess it was maybe 5:06. And we said bye-bye. It was like the cleaning staff and so on. 30 seconds later, my son said, oh, I forgot my jacket. He tried to get in, but the cleaning lady said, no, I'm not allowed to let anyone in there. So that's where you understand security, and I understand, but there have to be midways where,
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think that is quite a different one of kind of coming in and out. At the moment, we have a very open campus, and actually, because there's very little supervision in the evening, there's always a senior member of staff on site to do things. At some point, we actually have to close the school, and we have to say, go home. And inevitably, at some point, that means that a child's going to forget a tennis racket or something, and we're going to have to say, sorry, we're kind of closed now. The cleaning staff are not always, I don't know whether it's Vesna, are not necessarily, as we have kind of contracted cleaning staff who also come in as well. Dealing with that, I think, is something we need to kind of think out perhaps a bit. We also don't need to be ridiculous. Okay, I shall move along from security if that's okay. There were two questions which I wanted to go through. Actually, perhaps I just take. I shall take this. Sorry, I was aware I wasn't using the microphone there. So this was question number 1, which was about the introduction of Mandarin into the school. And I wrote back and said, actually, I consider myself a bit of an expert here, because the school where I was before was in Singapore, and about 3,000 students, about 1,800 students in the school took Mandarin, either as a first language or as a second language, predominantly as a second language. So I'm pretty good on Mandarin. I'm going to just use this data. So this is a thing which is freely available on the internet, should you be a statistically minded person like me. So the IB produces a statistical bulletin for both the diploma and the middle years programme, and it just goes through everything you can possibly imagine. It's not connected to the question, but there were 2 pieces of information which I think are just interesting. So the first one, these one up here, you can see these are the distribution of candidates. So this is Asia Pacific. Yeah. This colour here is the number of students in Africa, Europe and the Middle East. And this number of students are the students in the Americas. And it's a really interesting thing, because the IB used to be dominated by international schools, and that's no longer the case. It's just a really interesting shift over time. So the second thing which is interesting is these are the diplomas that were awarded last year, and as you can see, you've got here the diplomas awarded, the bilingual diplomas, and the children who failed for different reasons. So you can see the average is about 30, our average is about over here, kind of 35, 36. So our kind of cohort is skewed this way, we're shifted this way, as we should be. We're a school, we're a well-resourced school in an area where parents are very interested in education. However, I took these because, as you can see in the statistical bulletin, all the subjects are listed and they give you the grade distribution. Oh, I've just pushed the wrong button there. Here's the grade distribution, the percentage of students who got 7s and 6s and 5s and 4s, and there's the average grade, and there's the number of candidates. And it's important to look at the number of candidates too. So only 61 people in the world took astronomy standard level last year. Nobody from Lausanne. So if you look at the averages are around 4-ish, and that's consistent over time. The averages do change over time, but they're really about the same. You can see that some subjects, for example, design technology, is slightly below. Computer science, it looks actually is quite hard maybe because the mean is a bit depressed, but 4-ish is about normal. If you look at maths, for example, again, we have a grade of about 4 on average around the world. 176 students in the world do the further maths higher level. So when you look at the languages, what's fascinating is that Chinese B higher level has an average grade of 6.27, and Chinese B standard 5.98. So 843 there, 2,323, and you can see that most kids either get a 6 or a 7. Does that mean that Chinese is really, really easy? No. What that means is that these students are almost, are predominantly in Chinese-speaking countries where they're using Chinese very heavily. I know that in the students of my last school, almost everybody, in fact there was only one child taking Mandarin B standard level or high level who didn't receive regular tuition. Everybody in the high level group received at least 4 lots of tuition per week. It's a very, very, very tuition intensive course in general. That's not a reason not to do it, but it's interesting about the very anomalous position, if you like, of Mandarin. Here you can see French. You can see, of course, there are more children that take French around the world than Mandarin. The reason we don't offer Mandarin is actually a resource issue. Because if you start a Mandarin course lower down, when everyone's beginner, that's fine. But of course, as you go up, you need to provide more classes to allow for greater differentiation, because you will have some students who come in with some background. You've got children who learn faster than others. And so what happens is you get a kind of a spreading out, a tree. And because we have a limited amount of resource, more Chinese courses inevitably means less French or German or Spanish. And so at the moment, just in terms of the resource that we have, we're not going to offer Mandarin within the curriculum. There are a small number of students who do Mandarin outside the school as a kind of an extracurricular activity, but that's on top of the normal kind of fees. But for the moment, we don't think there's actually sufficient resource or sufficient demand to put it into the curriculum. It'd be a very, very, very expensive option for us. So that's the reason. Oh, yes. What I do think about Mandarin, and actually for a while I was really interested in Mandarin and Arabic as languages, because they're a non-Roman script. They come from a kind of different cultural background. I think it's a really interesting subject for an international student. There's an economic thing at the end as well, absolutely. But just in terms of understanding another is a fascinating idea. We just don't really have the resource to do it at the moment, so we have no plans to. The second question was about ASAs. So why is the allocation so difficult? Why can't it be done at the end of the previous year, for example, so that we can just get started? Why does it take so much time? Really good questions. Oops. Really good questions. In fact, on Thursday, the ASA team and I are having a bit of a retreat to start to look at after-school activities. The Board Quality and Standards Committee has asked us to do a kind of a complete audit of ASA. So at the moment, we are just starting on that. So we're going to try and understand why we offer what we do, how the processes work, and what we're trying to achieve through the ASA program. What we're trying to achieve is also really interesting. There will be some people in the school community who think that the most important thing is access. I want my children to just have a chance to experience a range of activities, hoping that they will find their passion. You will also have people who think, no, what the after-school activities is all about performance, high-level performance. We want kids to win trophies, and that supports the school, so that's where the resource should go. So we also have to try and tread a line between access and performance. We don't want to have teams that never win anything, because that's not motivating for the children to be thumped every time you go through. At the same time, we can't have a program which is only for elite athletes, because what about the children who are not elite? And the thing I put in the newsletter the other day about the Canadian requirement to have at least 1 hour of physical activity a day. What do we do to support that 1 hour of physical activity a day? But I thought I'd just quickly show you these, just for interest's sake. So here's how the process changed slightly this year, and so here's the thinking behind the process, that we construct the program, and then we ask children who are taking part in competitive teams to trial. And we do that next because not everyone gets into a competitive team. And if you are not chosen, but the choice has already gone, you're kind of left a bit on your own, as it were. So what happens is we do the competitive teams are chosen, and then the choices are open to everybody, including the people who didn't get in the competitive team. So that's the thought process. The drawback for that is it takes time. We don't do it the year before, because then we've got the question of how do we hold places for the people who are arriving? So I thought I would show you this. This is a graph of the activities we offer. And we have a whole range of activities with different numbers of people. How do we manage the sign up of that the year before if it just becomes incredibly hard to do? Also, interestingly, I thought I would show you this. This is the number of activities that children do per year group. So, in year 5, for example, one person does 7 activities. It's obviously a very, very busy boy or girl. Actually, 7 is not that unusual. We've got a child there with 6, got two children there with 6. We've got 6 children here with 5. It's a difficult process, and one of the things we've got to do actually is simplify that. There are arguments. Why would we allow a child to do 7 activities? What's the rationale for 7 activities? So we're going to try and think our way through that at the moment. So I don't have a good answer to those questions. I think at the moment we hope that this process led by the Quality and Standards Committee will get us to more clarity about what we offer, why we offer it, and how children can take part. Okay? Yes?
For me to view this graph, what is calculated? Only after school activities, or also the competition and the instrumental lessons, or?
So that is it does not include instrumental lessons. It includes competitive sports and recreation sports. Okay. This is terrible, actually.
I already even this question for ISL, but I did not really have an answer. So there's something I'm trying to see here, 1 and 2, because what was popular for the especially the boys, from the arts, board games and football, and they both stop at open break. And the other one has only 1 activity, and stopping of semester, I think that's really unfair. And ISL is not super helpful, that's something else for the people.
So I'm not actually in ASAs. I will guess the reason. So the reason there is we have a fixed amount of resource. We have a fixed amount of gym time. Yeah, that's right. They were outside. Now they have to come inside. So there you have an interesting thing where we are prioritising competitive sport over access.
But I feel like the primary, especially year 1 and year 2, because competition is always year 1 and year 2 that is cancelled. It's really unfair because there are only 1 after school activity.
Yeah, so I think that's something we have to look at. I don't know the situation well enough to give you a good answer.
I think for the ASL, it would be nice that when football stops or board game stops at open break, they get some kind of automatic replacement they can have.
Yeah.
Drawing or something. But they didn't answer to that.
Okay, thank you. So, any other? Oh, is that a comment or a question?
Just a comment and a quick one about the ASL. One of the different things they did this year was about the competitive teams. There's no tryouts. There's enough places.
Correct.
That's extremely positive.
Yeah.
Whether you're new kid to the school or you want to just try, because some kids just go to the tryouts because they're worried, they're scared. That for me was a huge improvement.
Good, thank you. Yeah, it makes sense, doesn't it? If there's enough places, well, then everyone gets to play. There's no point in trying out for something that you're going to get into. Any other questions? I tell you what, if I take about 5 or 10 minutes of questions, and then what I will do is I will finish this off, but I'll go outside, and if you've got individual questions, then I will stay to answer them. But are there any questions that people would like to raise? You can ask me anything, and I will do my best. Yes?
So for a lot of the initiatives that are changing or involving staff,
Yeah.
I'm trying to understand how you came to the decisions. Are these things supported from the bottom up and top down, or is it more like we, like you, with board, are making decisions and the teachers just have to follow along?
Okay, so the strategic planning worked in a number of ways. First of all, we had, so we went out and got information, as you know, from parents and from students and from staff. So we had, so all members of staff were involved in the information gathering. There was a steering committee of staff were the ones that actually developed the the key themes, if you like. So those were the group that I worked with. There were 10 members of staff in that group. Those were not senior members of staff. They were drawn from the teaching staff. On the back of their work, that went out to the different kind of leadership teams to say, okay, if this is the theme, how do we address this thing or this thing or this thing? Those came back to that core group, that steering group, and those went back to the staff to say, these are the things that we think make sense in this kind of situation. Do you agree? Now, we actually spent a lot of time going back to people to ask them their opinion, ultimately because we need them to do the work. And it's really important that the school feels purposeful, that actually what we're trying to do makes sense to the people who are going to do it. So we try to be very inclusive in that process. There is nothing at all in there which is purely mine. Clearly, there are bits and pieces which I think are really important and that I put my weight behind, but actually it's a very collaborative effort, I hope. One last question? Oh, yes.
Last question. No, I don't want to have this. But I brought up before, I'm really interested in establishing intergenerational dialogue in school, and I just wanted to ask if you see possibilities for having this established between generations of students, so to speak.
Yeah.
Because I know there's this buddy policy, when a new student comes in and say, play 2 is becoming a buddy. And I think it could be quite interesting to have this kind of mentoring scheme between older students and younger students, and have this kind of responsibility feeling. And I think a community can actually benefit from that.
Yeah, so the idea of the kind of intergenerational dialogue is interesting. So I met the new chair of the student parliament last week, Roy Tinney. And so he came on the back of the kind of student parliament, student council meeting, and one of their major topics, interestingly, was exactly what you were talking about. And so their solution is something that one of the students had seen in another school, which they call Big Sis, Little Sis. I don't know if people are aware of this as a kind of program, where you have an older student who is linked to a younger student, and they're just there as a kind of a big brother or a big sister. Or a big, yeah, anyway. And so that's something that's come from the students, which I think is fantastic, actually. It's a really good, and they had a number of other ideas. So your thinking is definitely coming from the students as well. That how do we get students to think? It also adds into service. There's a way of seeing service to the internal community as a good thing as well. So absolutely. So I will make that the last question. Thank you. Thank you very much for coming. Very much appreciate it. If you've got any questions, I'll stay around outside for about another 20 minutes, and you can ask me. Otherwise, thank you, and I hope you have a good day. Thank you very much.